So, um, Genesis 1 to 11 is that unusual part of the Bible that starts in Genesis 1 with the creation of the universe in 6 days, and then follows with Genesis 2 and 3 with God creating the first man, and then the first woman, and then them being in a garden and taking a fruit that's forbidden and being expelled from the garden to their children, Cain and Abel, and the first murder, followed by some genealogies, so family trees, followed by some odd stories leading up to the ark, where a flood is given in judgment of the world, followed by the people coming, Noah and his sons coming off the ark, and another genealogy, and the people coming together to build a large tower, and the languages of the world being created by God. It's a very unusual set of stories, common, not well to us, but unusual if you don't know the Bible. And before going into that, I just want to start with this idea of perspective. Sometimes you look at something and you just cannot see it. And other times you look at something and you just can't unsee it. So, take for example this woman spinning. This is a famous image of a woman spinning. And have a think. Is she going clockwise or anti-clockwise? And just have a good look. Who thinks she's going clockwise? We've got 3, 4, 5. Who thinks 6? Who thinks she's going anti-clockwise? Anti-clockwise. All right, good.
I can see both ways.
Okay, so she's, depending on how your brain interprets this picture, you can see it clockwise or anti-clockwise. And you just can't see it. How, once you see this clockwise, you think, how can anyone see that as anti-clockwise? Or vice versa. Neither's true, in a sense, or both are true. It's kind of a bit odd. What about this picture here? What do you see? A young woman or an old woman? So who sees a young woman? Simon and Neil.
That's easier.
And who sees an old woman? All right, so we've got an old woman as well. So if you look at her, we've got, this is the young woman's nose. This is the old woman's nose. This is her chin, the young woman's chin. This is the old woman's mouth. What about this dress? Is it, what color? Simon, what color is it? You see that as blue and black? Who else sees that as blue and black? Blue and black, blue and black, blue and black. I see that as yellow and white. That's gold and white to me. There's no blue and black at all there. And yet some people see it as blue and black. And it's all about how our eyes perceive this particular shades of light with what surrounds it. So it's really interesting that you see that as blue and black. Blue and black, is that what you said?
Yellow. Put your thing on the yellow.
The yellow bit. That one there, and the one above it is white.
What we see is black. You're seeing is yellow.
Yep, or gold. And what you see as blue, I guess, I'm seeing is white.
Gosh.
So it's quite remarkable. And this has gone around the internet, and it's a very well-known picture, which has about 50% of the population sees one colour and 50% sees the other colour. So it's just all about perspective, that sometimes we can see things differently than others, and we just can't see how someone else can see it the same way as us, or differently than us. And that's relevant for Genesis 1 to 11, because there are different perspectives on it, and some people just cannot see how other people perceive it to be. So some people see it as a fairy tale for children. Is that what it is? You know, 6 days the world was created. A man, a woman, a forbidden fruit and a serpent, an ark with all the animals on it, a tower where languages get created. Stephen Hawking, the famous physicist, used to say, religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. So is that what it is? Is that a fairy tale for children? Or maybe some people can perceive it as God's truth for adults. I like this quote from Ray Comfort. What proof is there of a builder A building is proof of a builder. What proof is there of a painter? A painting is proof of a painter. What proof is there of a creator? Creation is proof of a creator. So it has truth in it. Some people see Genesis 1:11 having truth about humans. Humans are incredibly valuable, which is why God says, whoever sheds the blood of humans, by his blood shall humans be shed. But humans are made in the image of God. It talks about death and destruction and why it's there, why the world is a hard place. So we see truth in it. Some people see it as fairy tales, other people see it as stories that give us truth. And I just want to compare it to an alternative explanation. At the Big Bang is an alternative explanation, and the Big Bang can be without God. So if you take an atheist perspective of the Big Bang, this is a universal origin story which postulates that 13.7 billion years ago, our universe emerged from a singularity, a point of infinite density and gravity that didn't exist before this event. Space and time didn't exist, which means the Big Bang took place at no place and no time. Right? That's the current explanation that's alternative to God. And Professor John Lennox is a famous mathematician and philosopher of science from Oxford University, and he's an excellent speaker. And this is his quote: Stephen Hawking says religion is a fairy tale for people afraid of the dark. I say atheism is a fairy tale for people afraid of the light. And he goes on to say, well, I'll read out this definition of atheism, which I found on the internet. Atheism is the belief that there was nothing and nothing happened to nothing, and then nothing magically exploded for no reason, creating everything, and then a bunch of everything magically rearranged itself for no reason whatsoever into self-replicating bits that turned into dinosaurs. And John Lennox talks about that, and this is his quote as well: nonsense is nonsense even when it's spoken by world-famous scientists. John Lennox, as you can tell, is a Christian with a strong belief in the creator, and Stephen Hawking is an atheist, or was an atheist with no belief in the creator, and both, of course, are scientists at world-renowned universities. And so I guess the point is that both atheism and Christianity require a miracle. Christianity requires the miracle that God exists and created everything. Atheism requires a miracle that nothing existed and a Big Bang happened and created everything. They're both miracles. So I think there's no reason why atheism is any less a fairy tale than the belief in God. I guess that's the perspective I'm trying to suggest. I guess the next thing about Genesis 1-11 is it poetry? Is it a parable? Is it history? Is it science? And I'm not going to suggest to you which one of these it is. We're all going to come to our own conclusions about this. But for example, that picture of Matthew when he was, 4 or 5, my son Matthew, they're both pictures of him. They both are truthful representations of him. The one's a really clear picture, and the bottom one is sort of a stained glass window, but they're still both pictures of him. And in the same way, is Genesis giving us a video picture of how everything started, or is it giving us more of a parable or poetic view of how everything started? And each one of us is going to make up our own minds with regards to that. But I guess it gets to just deeper questions of what is truth. The truth can be understood in different ways. Of course, we know Jesus said, "I am the truth." But I guess it's that idea that the truth can be sought at by different mechanisms, and science is the pursuit of understanding the truth of the physical reality of this universe. It's trying to understand what, when, and how. And sometimes when we think about God and the Bible, the truth that we're discovering is a little bit different. It's a truth more of why, trying to understand a spiritual reality. Take, for example, a boiling kettle. You can ask the question, why is the kettle boiling? And one answer is, well, it's boiling because the water is really hot and the molecules are banging together and they're turning into a gas, and out comes steam. That's a truthful answer. But another answer is, well, it's boiling because I turned it on because I want to have a cup of tea. Right? They're both true. They're looking at different perspectives. So, Genesis 1-11. I just want to put a few principles of how I read it and how I think it's helpful for a Christian to read it. One is accept that it's God's truth to us. It's worth acknowledging there are elephants in the room. There are some things that contradict a more modern secular worldview and Genesis 1 to 11. And so let's just allow for difference in perspectives. There are going to be ranges of Christian perspectives on Genesis 1 to 11. And obviously, some perspectives are going to be correct and some are going to be incorrect. But let's just let the different perspectives coexist. It's helpful to let them coexist. But having said that, I think it's worth letting Genesis 1 to 11 speak the way it's presented to us. Take it at face value, because you can get a lot more out of it taking it at face value. And it's helpful to recognize that Genesis 1 to 11, like the whole Bible, was given to a specific people in a specific historical and cultural context. So there's reasons it's written the way it is for those people. But at the same time, it's actually written to all people in all historical and all cultural contexts. And that includes us today. So it's got something to say to us today still. All right, so let's begin. Genesis 1 begins with the story of creation, or the account of creation. Who would like to read some extracts? Simon, do you want to read some extracts from Genesis 1?
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Then God said, "Let the land sprout with vegetation, every sort of seed-bearing plant, and trees that grow seed-bearing fruit. These seeds will then produce the kinds of plants and trees from which they came." That is what happened. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make human beings in our image, to be like us. They will reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, livestock, all the wild animals on the earth, and the small animals which scurry along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created. Then God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and govern it. Reign over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and all the animals that scurry along the ground." Then God looked over all he had made, and he saw that it was very good. Evening passed and morning came with laughing and six.
Excellent. So there's a lot of patterns in there that happen again and again. So this passage in Genesis was written at a time of the ancient Middle Eastern world, the ancient Near East. And it was worth noting that at that time, it was a context where there were many other worldviews about spirituality. For example, ancient Egypt, which is where obviously Moses came out of, from ancient Egypt. And they had this idea there were many gods, like Ra, the sun god, Khonsu, the moon god. Another feature of this world was there were also just creation stories. It wasn't just the idea there were many gods, but there were actually other creation stories that were written by different cultures in that time. And one of the most famous ones, which comes from around this time, is called the Enuma Elish. And this is from ancient Akkad, or the Sumerian type of people, on the other side of the Middle East, sort of where current day Iraq is. And there's some good tablets which have records of this story from around that time. And we're talking 1,500, 2,000 BC when this story was written. And in the Enuma Elish, here are some of the features of it. There are many gods. And for example, the primordial god was Apsu and his wife Tiamat. And from them, all other gods were formed. It was a time of creation, was a time of violence, where there was a god Marduk who created the earth and the sky and everything in it with body parts of other gods. There was evil. Some things were specifically created to be evil. There was this idea of servitude. Marduk created humans to be in service of the gods. It says in the Enuma Elish, in the translated version, "I will create man for the service of the gods." And everything was very chaotic. The Enuma Elish is a really weird story. I had to read it in Bible college, and it's bizarre. It's just a series of chaotic events. So that's where Genesis 1 fits in. It came into this context of many gods, chaotic stories of creation. And it tells a very contrasting, different type of account of creation. Firstly, it talks about one God and everything else being created. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, one God. And God made two great lights, for example, in it. The greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. So the sun is the greater light, the moon is the lesser light. They're created things. They're not gods. They're created things. Everything else has been created. So that's quite different than the Enuma Elish or the Egyptian worldview. Another thing about the Genesis account is it gives a story of day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, where there's structure, there's order, there's purpose within there. For example, day 1 and day 4 match up with light, sun, moons, and stars. Day 2 and 5 match up with sea and sky, fish and birds. Day 3 and 6 match up with land and plants and animals and humans. There's a structure there in the account of creation. And there's a purpose, and it's complete. Genesis 2 the account finishes in Genesis 2 with God blessing the seventh day, sanctifying it, and resting from all his work. So there's a purpose of rest in there. And then humans are quite different. In the Enuma Elish, humans were created to serve the gods. In Genesis 1:27, humans are made to image God. We're made in God's image. And that has a deep and rich meaning, which we'll probably look at a little bit down the track. And in the Enuma Elish and in the ancient stories, everything's violent and chaotic and evil. But in Genesis, everything is good. You'll see the word good multiple times come into the creation account. God saw that everything he had made was very good. And so there's a big contrast between the ancient world, what it said about creation, and what God had to say to the people about creation. And he spoke in a certain way so they could understand his nature and what creation was meant to be like. Now, today we have alternative views of how the universe was created too. We've got worldviews, we've got our own creation stories in a way, our scientific creation stories, you could say. And I'm going to go with a scientific worldview that's also atheist. So my dad mentioned to me that he thought it was a bit disingenuous, I'm not sure what the word is, but thought it wasn't right to necessarily link science and atheism up. And I think that's fair to say. So when I talk about things, I'm talking about the scientific view with the proviso that there is no God.
Scientism.
Yeah. And so that view says there's no creator. It says that everything that happens is random and was random. And there's an indifference in creation. There's no force behind there, no creator behind there trying to make or planning to make something happen. It's just indifferent to suffering, indifferent to death, pain, destruction. And it has this idea that ultimately science will be able to explain everything. So if you go back long enough, 70, 80 years ago, there was this idea that the universe always existed, the infinite universe idea. And that was predominant in the field of physics until about 30 or 40 years ago. And the reason that was predominant was because there's a law of conservation of energy and mass. You can't create energy, can't create matter. And so therefore the universe has to have always existed because it can't have come from nothing. So that was the common scientific view in the 19th and 20th century. Then with astronomy and developments in physics in the 20th century, astronomers looked into the sky and looked at the light coming from distant stars and discovered something called the redshift, where light changes based on how stars are moving, if they're moving towards or away from you. They look a bit different. It's called the redshift. And astronomers looked up and realized that all stars were moving away from the Earth, which meant the universe was expanding. And so taking it back to its logical conclusion, that meant the universe must have started at a single point and expanded from that single point, which led to the Big Bang Theory, which took 30, 40, 50 years before it was accepted. And many of the great physicists of the 20th century didn't like the Big Bang Theory because a number of them were quoted as saying it's too much like the Genesis 1 account. So Einstein didn't like it, for example. Fred Hoyle, he really didn't like it. He wrote this Big Bang idea seemed to me to be an unsatisfactory event before detailed examination showed that it leads to serious difficulties, because it does. It breaks the law of conservation of energy and mass. If the universe started as nothing and expanded from nothing, then where did that matter come from? How did it happen? And so clearly, I just show this to point out that scientific theories change. And also sometimes they change to be a little bit more like the way it's told in Genesis. So Genesis 1 does tell a different story than this no God Big Bang theory. Genesis 1 says there is a creator and there was a beginning. But it does sound awfully like the Big Bang, doesn't it? Let there be light is how Genesis 1 starts about the beginning of the universe. And the Big Bang begins with light expanding from nowhere. But I guess this scientific way of looking at it suggests everything's random and it just happens. There's no purpose behind it. Whereas in Genesis, it's planned. God planned events. Things happen because God said. Everything's indifferent in an entirely secular atheist worldview. There's no purpose. It's no good or bad. In Genesis, it's a good creation. God saw everything was good. So as I said before, both an atheist worldview and a Christian worldview require a miracle of some sort. One requires a belief that nothing became everything. The other requires a belief that God created everything. And there's that quote from Ray Comfort in a bit more detail. Every song has a composer, every book has an author, every car has a maker, every painting has a painter, every building has a builder. So it isn't irrational to take this simple logic a little further and say that nature must have a maker. It would be irrational to believe that it made itself. And in fact, the book of Romans says that. It says, since the beginning of time, people have looked up at the skies and see there must be a creator. So the other thing about Genesis 1, it doesn't just talk about the origin of the universe, it also talks about the origin of humanity. And it speaks about it a little bit differently than an atheist or secular worldview does. So in the atheist and secular worldview, and we'll talk about something called theistic evolution in a minute, it all began with Charles Darwin when he was on a trip into the Galapagos Islands, and the different islands he saw, finches had different beaks, and he determined that the different beaks existed because there were different environments on the islands, and so over time, over many generations, the finches changed, their beaks adapted so that they could survive, survival of the fittest, and find their food. And through that means one finch turned into different types of finches. And he wrote a book called The Origin of Species, and that process is called adaptation. And then further down the track, he spoke about how humans came to exist, and he wrote a book called The Descent of Man. And it wasn't just that one species could adapt in different directions, but over long periods of time, whole new species could develop through that process of slow change. And so that, in a sense, took away the need for God to create. In this approach, there's no meaning, no purpose, things just happen. And humans aren't different than animals. One of the implications of that, which I think is just worth thinking about, is if there's no meaning, no purpose, and humans are no different than animals, morality is very hard to explain. How do you explain why something is right or wrong? Is there there's not an external arbiter of reality, of truth, of morality. And so, as one person puts it, there's no book without an author and there's no morality without God. I think that's a pretty fair argument. I like the way that Ben Shapiro puts it. He said there can be a moral atheist, but there can't be a system built upon atheism that is moral. So Genesis 1 has something to say about all of this. Firstly, it says that humans are created. It doesn't say that it all was entirely by chance. There had to be the act of God to make humans. And now there are two different ways to think about this. One is, could it fit in with the process of evolution? And there are some Christians that hold that view, and that's called theistic evolution. God worked behind the scenes to make evolution happen to create humans. Again, I'm not passing value judgments on which one's right or wrong, just presenting different thoughts. And the other one is intelligent design, that everything is so complex, irreducibly complex. The cells, the human body, biology is so complex that nothing could have evolved entirely. There had to be a design. And God designed everything specifically. And that's gaining traction, and probably actually there are some scientists now that are starting to think more in, even some secular scientists starting to think more about intelligent design. But it's not mainstream at all. But that's the other thought, and that fits very much a creation view in Genesis, that humans were designed entirely. Second thing is in an evolutionary non-God perspective, there's no meaning or purpose, whereas there's clearly meaning and purpose in Genesis 1. People are created in God's image to rule or reign over the world and to subdue it. And to us, that can sound quite harsh, but being in God's image, I think, means having authority. God has authority over creation, and he passes that authority on to humans. That's a big part of what being in God's image means. And so that's why we're given dominion to rule over the world. And that doesn't mean to rule with an iron fist. I guess it means to rule with care and justice. So that's a big part of our purpose, to be in God's image with authority over the earth. So Genesis 1 has a lot to say about God. It says there is a God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. It says that creation is good. In Genesis 1, good is mentioned 7 times. The final time, it's very good. And 7 has an important idea of completion and perfection in the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the Genesis account, humans are the pinnacle of creation. We're actually incredibly valuable. We're the reason, from Genesis' perspective, God created everything leading up to humans. And that puts huge value on humans. And male and female are created in God's image. And we're given authority to be rulers. And finally, there was a purpose leading to rest. The whole end of creation was rest. And you see that by the number 7, even 7 days. 7 is completion, perfection. So there's that idea of rest. And just finally, something is interesting in there, and I guess a Jew may not agree with this perspective, but this is, I think, a Christian perspective. There's just this impression of the Trinity that comes into Genesis 1. From the very first chapter of the Bible, you can see glimpses of the Trinity. Firstly, God says, let us make man in our image. Who's us? Who's he talking to? Now, some perspectives are there's a heavenly council of divine beings, created heavenly beings. But one perspective is that's the Trinity, in speaking within the Trinity. Another thing is there's the Spirit of God. It's mentioned, Spirit, Holy Spirit. In the second verse of Genesis, there's a connection there. And we know in the book of John, which retells this creation account by saying in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were created through the Word, and the Word is Jesus. So we know that Jesus created the universe. So the Trinity, there's glimpses of the Trinity in Genesis 1, particularly when you take it in line with John 1. By the way, that where it says God down the bottom, that picture of the Trinity, the little symbols underneath is just the Hebrew word for God, Yahweh. So Genesis 1 leads into Genesis 2 and 3, which is a very unusual story of a garden, a man, a woman, a serpent, a forbidden fruit. So in it, God forms a man out of the ground, out of the dust, and breathes life, nephesh, into him. And he puts him in a garden, a place called Eden. And he says it's not good for the man to be alone. And he takes a rib of the man and makes woman. And then a serpent, craftier than any beast, comes and says to the woman, did God really say you can't eat from this tree? There's a tree that's been forbidden to be eaten from. So again, this is one of those unusual stories which creates immediate thoughts. Could this be real? Surely this sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? It certainly does to the secular world. Maybe, but again, this is maybe perspective needs to come into how we think about it. Could this be a parable? On the other hand, could this be history? Certainly it is written as if it's history. That's one thing that's important to note. This is written in the form of historical genre. But perception comes into it, how we think about it. And again, each one of us will come up with our own decisions about how we think about it. But just a little bit of food for thought. Years ago, there used to be this polycentric multi-regional hypothesis about the origins of humans. So the idea was that this is an evolutionary theory, is one of the two main evolutionary theories, was that humans evolved from Homo erectus, an ape-like creature, but this happened independently in Africa to get black Africans, Europe to get white Europeans, Asia to get Chinese Asians. So that was the theory, that you had these three separate groups of humans evolving independently. Then with the advent of modern genetics, a number of years ago, it was found that this wasn't true. So this is a picture of a cell here in the middle. And there's all this DNA, chromosomes in the center. And the chromosomes come from your parents. So my chromosomes come from my mum and dad, they're recombined. And so everyone's got unique DNA. However, there is some DNA that's not unique. Within the nucleus there is a Y chromosome in every man. And that Y chromosome is identical to his father's chromosome, which is identical to his father's chromosome, which is identical to his father's chromosome. And within every person there are these little things called mitochondria, which have some DNA. And that mitochondria only comes from your mother. And her mitochondria only comes from her mother. So you look at the DNA in the mitochondria and you know it's from your mum. The Y chromosome, you know it's from your dad. And you know that it doesn't, his came from his dad and hers came from her mum and so on. And when you look at that, between generations, there's mutations that happen. And these mutations are slow, only 1 or 2 mutations per generation. And so you can look at someone's DNA, their Y chromosome, you can look at my Y chromosome and compare it with Simon's, and there'd be 1 or 2 differences. Simon's and his brothers would have 1 or 2 differences. But Simon and his cousins would have 3 or 4 differences. Simon and some other person who's distantly related might have 10 differences. And Simon and someone on the other side of the world might have 100 differences in his DNA. And so you can take those differences and work out, actually, the Y chromosomes are almost identical. The mitochondria are almost identical. And geneticists have worked out that means that actually, if you take every human around the world, every man has 1 male ancestor that you can trace their ancestry back to. So we all have a great grandfather. And it's the same one for all of us. And the same thing for women. Every woman has a certain number of great grandmother, and it's the same woman. So all of humanity today is derived from 1 man and 1 woman. And that's a well understood genetic concept now. And of course, it doesn't say anything about the men and women that were before that man and woman, if there were men and women before that woman. So the atheist worldview is, yes, we can all trace our male ancestors back to 1 man, but before him there were a whole lot of men, and most of them died off in some sort of terrible event. And 1 of them survived, and everyone's derived from him. And the same thing with a woman. But nonetheless, we no longer have a multi-regional hypothesis. Science shows us a 1 man and a woman, 1 woman hypothesis of human origins. And in fact, because it's so much like the story of Adam and Eve, the common scientific terminology that's used is mitochondrial Eve was the common ancestor who's a woman, and Y chromosome Adam, the common ancestor who's everyone's great-great-grandfather. So again, just shows that science sometimes changes its perspective. And again, it just sounds a little bit more like the Genesis account. So the other thing, there are some truths in this story as well that are worth thinking about. One is that there's purpose in the man. God takes the man, forms him out of the ground. By the way, the man is called Adam. That means man in Hebrew, and he comes from Adamah. That means dirt. So it's a play on words that's happening in Genesis there. Forms the man and puts him in the garden to work it and to care for it. So the man is actually given a purpose. So Genesis 2 shows purpose for a man. The purpose is work and care. And then brings to the man all the animals to name. And naming is a really critical thing in the Old Testament. Names are linked with identity, with origin, with purpose. So a name gives you an idea of what your purpose is and who you are. And it also links this idea with relationship, in particular authority. Someone is named by the one who has authority over it. And so God bringing the animals to the man shows that man has authority over the animals. The other interesting thing about names in the Bible is I think names are received. They're not chosen. They're given to us. We don't choose our names. We're meant to receive them. And there's something powerful and sacred about names in the Bible. And so the man is given authority by naming, and that's shown by naming. And then a woman is made. And Genesis 2 talks about the purpose of a woman. Firstly, God says it's not good for the man to be alone. I'll make him a helper. So the purpose of a woman, according to Genesis, is to be a helper. And that's a good purpose. God talks about himself as a helper. So that's part of God's image, be a helper. And interesting, the man says, she shall be called woman. So he names the woman, I guess, for she was taken out of man. And that's another play on words. Another word for man in Hebrew is ish, and the word for woman is isha. So again, there's lots of plays of words happening that we don't see easily, but are in the passage. And I've just put there a really good sermon by Martin Iles on this. He looks at the idea of gender in Genesis 2 and 3, and it's a really good sermon worth listening to. I've popped it in the PowerPoint, the link. All right, then what happens next is a serpent comes. Now, God has commanded the woman and the man not to eat of a tree of good and evil, because if they do, they will die. And the serpent comes to the woman. And the serpent, by the way, is from the word nakash in Hebrew, which can mean serpent, but can also mean deceiver, or can also mean shining one. So we read it as serpent, and it's a good translation. But it's interesting, it's got other translations as well. So we think of a snake, but it may be that the ancient Hebrews didn't think of a snake at all. I'm not sure. But it's just interesting, it lines up with 2 Corinthians 11, which says, Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light, and serpent means shining one. And he talks to the woman, and he asks her, did God really say? And so he puts questions about God's word into the woman. And it reminds me of the story of the temptation of Jesus, where the devil comes and tempts Jesus, and Jesus holds his ground by saying, no, this is what God says. But unfortunately, Eve and the man didn't say, no, this is what God says in the right way. And so they eat, and they break God's law. They turn against God. They separate themselves from what God's called them for. And so God banishes them from Eden, which, by the way, means delight. They were in a delightful place, and they lose that because of their separation from God. And each of them gets a curse. The serpent gets a curse with enmity between the serpent and the woman and her offspring. The woman gets a curse with pain in childbirth and disharmony and discord with the husband. And the man gets a curse of pain and thistles and return to dust, death. And so this is the explanation of why death exists in the biblical worldview. It's interesting. I think there's a bit of a prophecy of Christ even within this. So, for example, the curse for the serpent is, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head. You will strike his heels. It's an image of Jesus striking Satan on the cross, and Satan striking Jesus, I guess, on the cross. The pain in childbirth, it reminded me of a passage in Hosea where God talks about how he feels so much pain losing his son Israel. And then the thorns that the man has as part of his curse just make me think of the crown of thorns. There are little images, just little subtle thoughts about the cross already here in Genesis 2 and 3. So, of course, the elephant in the room again is this a parable? Is this history? Well, one thing I just do want to point out, if we say it's a parable and we go with the idea of theistic evolution, have to be able to explain death. How does death get explained? This explains death one way, but evolution requires death to occur for it to happen. So it does create a problem that needs to be wrestled with. And certainly the Bible speaks about this as history. For example, Paul says, since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. And I put the really good YouTube clip from an excellent archaeologist. He has a show called Bible Expedition Bible, and he's gone looking for in Eden. In Genesis, it talks about the 4 rivers around Eden, and one of them is called the Pishon River. And he goes looking for where the Pishon River could be, and therefore where Eden could have been. It's well worth a watch. So Genesis 2-3 gives a message. It's got something to say. It says men and women are created with a purpose. We're relational. We're meant to be together. We walk with God, with each other. And sin is what brings us separation from God and therefore death. And the world was meant to be good. It's not meant to be like this. There is a real message in Genesis 2 and 3. So after Genesis 2-3, we get to Genesis 4-6. It gets a bit faster now, don't worry. And that is the first 2 sons of Adam and Eve, where there's Cain and Abel, and they bring an offering to God. And it's a bit of an unusual story. We don't know why, but for some reason, God doesn't accept the offering of Cain, but he does of Abel, and something to do with bringing your best. Abel brings his best to God, whereas Cain doesn't. And that's just an important, I guess, principle for us to remember. We have to bring our best to God. In any case, because of this, Cain gets jealous, and God warns him. Do well, you'll be accepted. Sin lies at your door. It desires you, but you need to rule over sin. But Cain doesn't heed God's warning, and he lets sin rule over him, and he kills his brother Abel. And so God banishes Cain. And Cain, of course, says, my punishment's greater than I can bear. And God says, well, I'll be with you still. I'll put a mark on you so that no one kills you. So even within his punishment, God gives Cain some grace. So even pictures of grace are happening. There's consequence for sin, but grace we're starting to see already, even in Genesis 4. And Genesis 4 ends with Seth being born, the 3rd son of Adam and Eve. And there's this really odd line, which I just wanted to take a look at. It says, around this time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Very odd statement. I don't really know what it means. But it's just interesting. There's all these little snippets in Genesis 1-11 that you read and think, what does that mean? Clearly, there's a lot we could get out of it that we maybe just don't understand. But the name of the Lord is Yahweh. So this is the word here, Yahweh. And that's translated in many Bibles as Lord with capital L-O-R-D. And it's God's personal name. It's who he revealed himself to be. It's who he calls himself. Interestingly, the word God, there are all sorts of different names for God in the Bible. Yahweh is his personal name. But the word God in Hebrew is El. El means God. And you'll know El Shaddai, God Almighty. He's talked about as El Elyon, God Most High. El Roy, the God who sees. El Olam, the God who's everlasting. So there's different phrases and terms used for God, but Yahweh is his personal name. And one more really interesting about the name God, the word God. This is how the Bible begins. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It doesn't say in the beginning Yahweh created the heavens and the earth. It says in the beginning Elohim created the heavens and the earth. And Elohim is the plural form of El. Elohim is actually a plural word for God. And it's a word that appears a lot in the Old Testament, and sometimes it's translated as God, sometimes as gods, sometimes as idols, demons, spirits. It's got all sorts of translations. And it's just an odd word because it's the word that God uses for himself as well, Elohim. And what's really strange about it is it's plural, but it's also singular. If you go to later on in the Bible, it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one." And it says, Yahweh, the Lord, your God, Elohim, is one. So it's almost like the Trinity is inbuilt into the name of God there as well. One God. But it's not the word El, it's the plural Elohim that's used. So there's lots of really interesting things about the name God and Yahweh and the way God is spoken about in the Bible. And this other word Elohim is just interesting. It gives us this idea there's 2 types of creation. There's this physical universe we see around us, and then there's Elohim everywhere, which are spiritual beings. And that's not us. We're physical, but there's spiritual beings like angels. And so there's this unseen realm That's already come into the early Genesis picture. So after this, we then have the genealogy, the son and grandson and great-grandson of Cain, the one who murdered Abel. And they get eviler and eviler. You end up with Lamech, who murders a man. And then the sons of Seth. And what's really interesting is it talks about these genealogies. It goes, Seth lived this many years, and then he had a son, and then he lived this many more years. And it's a bit odd because all of these people live for like 500 years. And that seems crazy, doesn't it? People living to 900 years. How odd is that? So that's one of the elephants in the room again. Because if they lived 900 years and you can follow down this list of names and you get to Noah, and then you can follow down Noah to Abraham and Abraham to Jesus and Jesus to us today, you can actually work out that the world, according to the Genesis account, if you take it at face value, is 6,000 years old. Or if you read the Septuagint, the ages are slightly different, it's 7,000 years old. But how does that fit in with our understanding of the universe? You look at a star, which is 1,000,000 light years away. It means the light took 1,000,000 years to reach Earth. So how can light have reached Earth if it's only 7,000 years old or 6,000 years old? So it does create questions that people will ask. Same with something like carbon dating. So carbon dioxide up in the upper atmosphere gets hit by UV radiation. You end up with a radioactive form of carbon-14. It gets breathed in into a living being, and we die, and the carbon-14 starts to degrade, and over time, half of it's degraded, and that takes 5,000 years to lose half of it, another 5,000 to lose the next half. And so you can date things that have been alive with carbon dating. And carbon dating gives us things that are alive 10, 20, 30,000 years ago, they died. So how does that fit in with this picture of the Earth that's 6,000 or 7,000 years old? That's just a question that's worth thinking about. And I guess it's kind of an elephant in the room. How do you reconcile this scientific evidence indicating that there's an old universe basically with the genealogy of Genesis 5? Well, they both have problems. Either explanation is going to have a problem. And I'll leave you to think about how you'll reconcile it and what you'll decide. But I want to talk about the genealogies. So it goes through the list of Adam's son, Seth, and then his son Enosh, all the way to Noah. And we read it and just see all these names. And if you go to 1 Chronicles, it just lists the names: Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah. But in Hebrew, all the names have meanings. So people might have been named Adam, but Adam means man. So you could read it as Adam or man. And the meanings of the names are really quite remarkable. If you read them in order, this is the genealogy in Genesis 5. Man appointed mortal, sorrow, the blessed God, shall come down, teaching. His death shall bring despairing comfort and rest. I mean, that is remarkable, isn't it? That's almost the gospel in the genealogy in Genesis 5. I find that absolutely remarkable. Then there's the...
Today, the Hebrew words, they haven't changed?
Yeah.
That's, if somebody didn't know that at all, and they just to change the Hebrew and just did it, that's
what the root meanings are, yeah. It may not be grammatically correct,
no.
But that's what it can mean, yeah. So after the genealogy of Seth, it then goes on to talk about sons of God and daughters of men and Nephilim. Oh, by the way, just a few interesting names there. Enoch. Enoch's a good name. Enoch is an unusual one in that genealogy because he didn't die. Everyone else there died except Enoch. It says Enoch lived 300 years, or give or take, and then he walked with God and was no more. So there's something about God still having a special relationship with certain people. And then Methuselah, his name means his death shall bring. And Methuselah died the year of the flood. If you add all the numbers up, his death shall bring the flood. The year he died. And then, of course, Noah brings rest and comfort. So the story continues on to this weird story of sons of God and daughters of men and Nephilim. Very odd story. We'll see if we get finished. May have to finish early. Yep. So it says when man began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw the daughters of man were attractive. They took their wives any that they chose. The Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. So again, there's just these weird passages that just pop up, showing us that the world was clearly very different. So daughters of God, men, sons of God, no idea what that means. So the phrase is sons of Elohim, and in Greek in the Septuagint, it's just sons of God, like in English. Don't really know who they are, but the most common understanding among scholars is they were actually heavenly creatures of some sort, demons. We don't know though. We don't know what they are. There's different ideas, but whatever was happening, God obviously decided that this was terribly wrong. Whatever was happening, whether it was heavenly beings sleeping with women and having Nephilim or having children anyway, that was evil in God's sight. And all of this was leading up to his judgment of the flood. The other thing is these Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. Again, no idea what the Nephilim were, who they are. The word Nephilim is just a transliteration of the Hebrew. So this is what it is in the Old Testament. It just says Nephilim. So they've just put Nephilim in modern translations of the Bible because we don't know what they were, what they are. But if you go back to the ancient Greek translation, they use the word gigantus, giants. So that's why in some translations you'll see it as giants. So whoever these Nephilim were, they were obviously giant men of some sort.
What do they mean by renown? Just
Famous, yeah. But again, it's just showing you that this was a different world. Something was different about the world then. And there's some spiritual things happening that we don't understand. One other thing that was interesting is God seeing evil all the time at this stage. He sees wickedness in man's heart all the time. And so he says, I will blot them out. And that's where the judgment of the flood came. God was grieved. It's interesting to see he actually felt pain. God found this incredibly sad, obviously. He was grieved. And so he brought the flood. And he says his days shall be 120 years. Man's days shall be 120 years. And most scholars take that to mean God's made a decision in 120 years, there's going to be the flood from this time. And he says that to the people, gives them a chance to repent and change. What's interesting is in the 1960s and 70s, with modern genetics and cell biology, it was discovered that humans live without any. If you didn't get an illness, we would all die at 120. That's how long we can live. It's called the Hayflick effect. And when cells divide, human cells divide, they have a maximal lifespan of 120 years. So we're all going to die at 120, even if we don't get an illness. Our body just degenerates by that time. So I find it remarkable that these things line up. It's quite amazing. But then we have a flood happening, and it seems crazy, doesn't it? A flood, a worldwide flood, every animal on one boat. Could this be real? I'll leave it for you to decide. Just one thing to note, the word all the world is flooded, is the same word that all thoughts of all people's hearts were wicked all the time. So it could be hyperbole. But nonetheless, it does say all. And this is there are dimensions of the ark that are given in the Old Testament, in Genesis. And this is a replica that's been built in America. And so these are with what they think the measurements are. So it's quite large. So there could be a lot of animals that fit on there. But anyway, just it is a good question to ask. Could this at all be real? I mean, a flood for the whole world does seem a bit crazy. It's worth noticing, though, that around the world, hundreds of ancient cultures have a flood myth where the world was flooded. This is not a unique myth to Christianity. In China, Finland, Greece, India, Australia, Chile, all around the world, there are flood myths. So you wonder, do these stories come from somewhere? And interestingly, there's a flood myth developing today in modern archaeology. So there's a man called Graham Hancock. He's a bit of a maverick archaeologist. But he believes there was a worldwide civilization, and there's got a growing following of people that think this, looking at different wall structures and building structures around the world, saying, look, this in South America looks the same as it does in Egypt, as it does in Japan. How can they all have the same exact structure of these huge, massive walls? And so he believes there was a worldwide civilization, and there's some evidence apparently that there was a massive cataclysmic event that destroyed this worldwide civilization, and it's even got a name. It's called the Younger Dryas Cataclysm. And so if you go look it up, you'll see there's a big body of people who believe there was a worldwide environmental event that killed off this worldwide civilization, and only a few humans survived to repopulate the earth. They say it happened 11,000 years ago. And the main contender for this worldwide event is a change in temperature that caused a massive flood. So there's a flood myth redeveloping today anyway as well. Again, it just shows that science sometimes changes, or at least interpretation changes. And I've just popped this little video up. It's worth a watch. It's about DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and how it all leads back to one woman. And it's a fascinating watch from a geneticist, and how he puts it together with the story of Eve and the three wives of the sons of Noah. So Noah came as a righteous man, and he did what God commanded, so he was righteous. But in Hebrews it says he was righteous because of his faith. Again, there's that link of the New Testament. Noah was righteous because he had faith to believe God, and so he built an ark. The story also shows a story of grace. God puts Noah, his wife, his sons and their daughters on a boat and saves them from judgment. So we see a picture of grace emerging in Genesis 1-11. And then it finishes with some images of him releasing a dove. And that makes me think of the Holy Spirit. Jesus, when he's put into water, the dove comes on him. The Holy Spirit comes on him. And so that image of the dove and the Holy Spirit is somewhere in this story. And then there's the rainbow. After Noah comes out of the ark, he goes onto ground and God shows him a rainbow. And associated with that is a promise that God makes, a covenant, an agreement, where God says, I'll never destroy the earth again by a flood. And he says, be fruitful and multiply. So Noah's told to multiply. And then there's a very odd story about nakedness. So straight after the ark, Ham sees Noah's nakedness, which is an ancient idiom to do with sex. And so Noah gets drunk, and Ham, one of his sons, sleeps with his mother. And that's what that idiom means. And then Noah curses Ham's son of Canaan. And that's Canaan is the Canaan that becomes the people who live in the land of Canaan, the Canaanites. And God blesses, or Noah blesses Shem. And Shem is the ancestor of Abraham. So there's all these links happening between Genesis, the story of Noah, and later Genesis and later biblical events. And finally, in the last couple minutes, the people were called to disperse. God says, fill the earth. But instead of dispersing, they moved into the land of Shinar, which is probably the ancient way of saying Sumer. And they had one language, according to Genesis. Dwelling in the land of Shinar, they built a tower. Perhaps they built it to try to get above future floodwaters. They did it at a place called Babel, which in Akkadian means gateway to God. God saw this, and that they were breaking his command to disperse. And he sees and wonders, look at what people can do. If they're of one voice together, look at the evil they can commit. And so he comes down and he confuses their language and gives them multiple languages. And that's a play on words again. It says this place is called Babel, gateway of God, because God confused, Baaled them. So it's again a play on words, which happens throughout the Hebrew scriptures. In that division, one thing that's interesting is as God divided the people into different languages, he actually gave us a way of separating us so we don't work together for great evil. So there's even grace within this division. And we've got these language families now today. So if you take all the languages of the world, take, for example, about 150 years ago, there was a scholar who looked at the Indian language, ancient languages, Sanskrit, Latin, and ancient Greek. And he thought they're so similar. And he realized they all came from a parent language. And English comes from that parent language, just as German and French. And it's called the Indo-European language family. They all came from one language, all these languages of Europe. If you go back far enough, you can see over time, it changed enough in different places to give us all the languages we have today. of Europe. And it turns out there are a bunch of these language families around the world. And one of the holy grails of linguistics is to try to find the one language that everyone started with. So they say that all the languages have evolved from one language. But despite the fact that we've got maybe 10, 15, 20, no one knows how many language families, no one's ever been able to show all those language families come together to form one root language, which I think is interesting because it's consistent with the biblical story of Babel, God creating separate languages. And then finally, I just wanted to show you this YouTube clip. This is an amazing clip. Ancient Chinese has been written for about 4,000, 5,000 years. And all of the symbols have a particular meaning. And within a Chinese word, there are multiple mini symbols that have a meaning. And this Chinese man goes through some of the words in ancient Chinese language, and he shows what the symbols mean. And within those symbols, there's all the stories of Genesis 1 to 11. It's quite amazing, and it's like a few of these videos, it's really interesting to listen to. Then after Babel, the people disperse, and it gives us the list of the different peoples that disperse. And just some of the names are interesting in there. I'll just make note of a few. For example, there's Magog. Magog comes up later in the Bible and is thought to be a people of the north. And there's questions about whether that could be Russia. Javan is thought to be people of Greece. It comes up further in the Bible again as well in Daniel 8. Nimrod is mentioned, and he's linked with a real character called Sargon of Akkad, who was the person who founded Nineveh. And according to the Bible, it's someone called Nimrod. Mizraim became the father of Egypt, and Egypt to this day is still called Mizraim in its own language. And then Shem became the father of Abraham eventually, and Shem is where the word Semite comes from. And Shem had a great-grandson, Eber, which I've discovered after looking it up is where the word Hebrew comes from. And then we get to Abraham, which we're going to start at next week. So what are these stories of old? Oh, actually, one more thing. There are two different timelines in the Old Testament. One is the Masoretic text timeline. The other is the Septuagint timeline. The Septuagint actually has different ages for when when birth was given to when the men gave birth to their first son. And so we've got actually different timelines. One, if you actually took it at face value, one dates the world at 4,000 BC, the other one at 5,500 BC is when creation happened. Okay, so what do the stories of old tell us? Well, they tell us this: despite what an atheist says, there is a creator. And he cares deeply about his creation. And he actually gave us a purpose. And that purpose is intimately connected with relationship, with each other, and with him. Problem is, our sin has destroyed creation, and it's destroyed our relationship with him and with each other. Our sin has brought us death. But from the very beginning, God actually showed mercy, and he showed grace, and he's steering the events of history. God's in charge of history, and he's making these events, steering them towards something. The question is, what is that something? And I guess that's what the rest of the Bible is all about. All right, Malcolm, I'm sorry I went 5 minutes over. All yours.
Okay. So I think you'll agree that Graham's done a good job of summarizing Genesis, and also in demonstrating the way that that a secular view of the world, a view that's independent of the Christian view, has actually sort of is on a trajectory towards agreement with the Christian view of the world, which I think is and we'll see that throughout our whole study, that this is the way that archaeology works, this is the way that historicity or historiography works. These things are something that converging on truth. And of course, the truth is God's truth. So I think that convergence is actually a more powerful testimony to the truth than if they had started there, because we can see that they didn't want to start there, but they're forced back to truth. So it's a more powerful argument for the truth of our belief than if they initially agreed with us. So, questions?